The blizzard hit past midnight. Ethan Brooks was mopping the 43rd floor when he found her collapsed near the elevator. Victoria Hale, the CEO, whose face filled the lobby portraits, now curled on cold marble, shivering and incoherent. Her fever spiked through his palm. When he reached for his radio to call security, she grabbed his wrist with shocking strength. "Please," she whispered, eyes wild with panic. "Don't tell my father." He had 30 seconds to decide. Follow protocol and protect himself, or carry an unconscious billionaire out of the building and risk everything he had left. Ethan Brooks had learned to be invisible. In 3 years of night shifts at Hale Tower, he had perfected the art of moving through hallways without being seen, cleaning executive offices without leaving a trace of his presence. The security guards knew his face, but not his name. The day staff passed him in the lobby without eye contact. He preferred it that way. Invisibility meant safety, and safety meant he could keep his daughter fed and warm in their small apartment 6 blocks from the building. Lily was 8 now, old enough to understand why her father left every evening at 9 and returned just before she woke for school. She never complained about the babysitter who dozed on their couch, or the way Ethan sometimes fell asleep at the breakfast table with his coffee going cold. She drew pictures of him in her notebooks, a stick figure with a mop, always smiling. He kept every single one taped to the refrigerator. The work itself was simple. Vacuum the carpets, empty the trash bins, wipe down the glass conference tables until they gleamed under the motion sensor lights. Floor by floor, he moved through a building that represented everything he would never have. Wealth, power, the kind of security that came from never having to check your bank balance before buying groceries. But resentment was a luxury he could not afford. The paycheck came every 2 weeks, like clockwork, and that was enough. Victoria Hale existed in his world, only as a name on a bronze plaque in the lobby and a portrait in the executive elevator. Her face, sharp cheekbones, dark eyes that seemed to look through the camera rather than at it, appeared occasionally on the financial news channel that played silently in the break room. She ran Hale Industries with the precision of someone who had never been told no, who had never scrubbed floors or counted pennies. Their lives should never have intersected. The 43rd floor was her domain. The service elevator was his. The building operated on a rhythm Ethan had memorized down to the minute. Security swept each floor at 11:15. The HVAC system kicked on at 11:30, making the windows rattle slightly in their frames. By midnight, the entire tower was supposed to be empty, except for him and the lone guard stationed in the lobby. That was the routine. That was the safety. The blizzard warnings had been scrolling across every screen since morning. But Ethan had seen worse. Chicago winters were not kind to anyone, rich or poor, and the city knew how to function through snow. He took the blue line to work as usual, watching the first flakes start to fall as the train emerged from the subway tunnel. By the time he clocked in at 9, the wind had picked up enough to make the tower's revolving door shudder with each gust. The lobby guard, Marcus, one of the few who bothered to nod at him, mentioned that most of the executives had left early. Smart move. The snow was supposed to get heavy around midnight, the kind that turned streets into parking lots and made the morning commute a nightmare. Ethan did not have the luxury of leaving early. His shift was 8 hours, and he needed every cent of those 8 hours to make rent. He started on the 20th floor and worked his way up, the building growing quieter with each level. The hum of the HVAC, the distant groan of the elevator cables, the tap of his mop handle against the baseboards. These sounds filled the empty spaces where voices and footsteps normally echoed. Outside the windows, the snow fell harder, transforming the city lights into a blur of gold and white, beautiful in a way that made him think of Lily, who loved snow days more than anything. The 43rd floor was executive territory, corner offices with views that stretched to the lake, conference rooms with chairs that probably cost more than his monthly salary, a waiting area with leather couches that still smelled new. He had cleaned this floor hundreds of times, moving efficiently through the same pattern. Offices first, then the hallway, then the glass-walled conference room at the far end. Tonight felt no different until he rounded the corner near the elevators and saw her. Victoria Hale was on the floor, not sitting, not resting, collapsed. Her body curled against the marble like she had tried to crawl toward the elevator and failed. Her suit jacket was twisted around her shoulders, one shoe off. Dark hair stuck to her forehead with sweat. Ethan's first instinct was to call out, but the sound died in his throat when he saw how still she was. He dropped the mop. It clattered against the floor, the sound too loud in the silence. His second instinct was to run for help, to hit the emergency button in the elevator, to call Marcus downstairs and let someone with authority handle this. But then she moved a small jerking motion, her hand reaching out like she was trying to grab something that was not there. Ethan knelt beside her, his knees hitting the cold marble. Up close, he could see the fever in her flushed face, the way her breath came too fast and too shallow. Her eyes opened, unfocused, pupils dilated in a way that meant she was not seeing him clearly. When he touched her forehead, the heat shocked him. This was not just a fever. This was dangerous. "Miss Hale," he said, keeping his voice low and steady. "Can you hear me? I need to call for help." Her hand shot out and grabbed his wrist with a strength that seemed impossible given her condition. Her eyes focused on him for a split second, lucid enough to recognize the uniform, the mop bucket, the fact that he was nobody important. "Please," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Don't tell my father." The request made no sense. Her father, Richard Hale, the founder of the company, a man whose net worth appeared in Forbes lists, would want to know if his daughter was sick. Any father would. But the desperation in her voice was real, edged with something close to terror. She was not asking. She was begging. Ethan pulled out his radio, the one that connected him directly to building security. All he had to do was press the button. Marcus would send paramedics. They would take her to a hospital where people with medical degrees could actually help her. He would file an incident report, clock out, go home to Lily, and forget. Clear his throat this ever happened. That was the smart choice. That was the only choice that did not end with him in a lawsuit or worse. But her grip tightened on his wrist, her nails digging in hard enough to hurt. In her eyes, beneath the fever and the fear, he saw something he recognized. The same look Lily had when she woke from nightmares. The look that said the worst thing in the world was not the monster under the bed, but the idea that no one would believe her when she said it was there. Ethan made the decision in the space between heartbeats. He clipped the radio back onto his belt without pressing the button. Then he did the math in his head. The service elevator opened directly into the loading dock, which was always empty after 10. His car was parked in the employee lot, covered in snow by now, but functional. His apartment was 20 minutes away in good weather, maybe 40 inches this storm. If he moved fast, if he was careful, if no one saw him leave with an unconscious billionaire in his arms, he might pull this off without destroying his life. The alternative was watching her deteriorate while waiting for an ambulance that might not make it through the blizzard, or worse, calling her father and watching whatever terror lived in her eyes become reality. He had spent 3 years being invisible. Tonight, he would use that invisibility for something that mattered. He got one arm under her shoulders, the other under her knees, and lifted. She was lighter than he expected, her body limp and burning with fever. Her head rolled against his chest, and for a moment he thought she had lost consciousness completely. But then she murmured something too quiet to hear, her hand curling into the fabric of his uniform shirt. The service elevator took a full minute to arrive, each second stretching out while Ethan listened for footsteps, voices, the ding of the main elevator. That would mean someone had seen him. The doors finally opened onto the empty metal box he had ridden thousands of times. He stepped inside, hit the button for the loading dock, and watched the numbers descend. 434241. Each floor, another chance to change his mind, to stop the elevator and call for real help. He did not press the button. The loading dock was dark and freezing, the overhead door rattling in the wind. Snow had drifted against the parked delivery trucks, covering everything in white. Ethan carried Victoria through the dock and out into the employee lot, his boots sinking into fresh powder with each step. The wind hit them immediately, sharp enough to make his eyes water. Victoria shivered violently in his arms, her fever no match for the sub-zero air. His car, a 15-year old sedan with a heater that barely worked and 200,000 m on the odometer, was buried under 6 inches of snow. He managed to get the passenger door open one-handed, settled Victoria into the seat, and pulled the seat belt across her chest. She did not wake. Her breathing had gone shallow again, her lips taking on a bluish tint that made his stomach drop. Ethan brushed the snow off the windshield with his bare hands, then climbed into the driver's seat and turned the key. The engine coughed, sputtered, and finally caught. He cranked the heat to maximum, even though it barely worked, then pulled out of the lot onto streets that had gone white and empty. The drive home took 50 minutes. Every red light felt like a trap. Every passing car felt like a witness. By the time he pulled into the narrow alley behind his building, his hands were shaking so hard he could barely turn off the ignition. He carried Victoria up the back stairs to his second-floor apartment, praying the babysitter had not fallen asleep on the couch where she could see him enter. The door opened onto darkness and silence. He could hear Lily's soft breathing from the bedroom, the babysitter's quiet snoring from the living room. He took Victoria straight to his own room, barely more than a mattress on the floor and a single dresser, and laid her down as carefully as he could. Only then, with the door closed and the sound of the blizzard muffled by old walls, did Ethan let himself think about what he had just done. He had kidnapped a billionaire. That was what the police would call it, what the lawyers would call it, what the headlines would scream if anyone ever found out. It did not matter that he was trying to help. It did not matter that she had asked him not to call her father. He was a poor man with a sick, rich woman in his bedroom, and no story he could tell would change how that looked. But she was still breathing, still alive, and that had to count for something. He soaked a towel in cold water and pressed it to her forehead the way he did when Lily spiked fevers. Her skin was so hot the water steamed. He needed medicine, fluids, someone who knew what they were doing. What he had was a bottle of children's ibuprofen in the bathroom cabinet, and a prayer that morning would bring answers instead of consequences. Victoria woke to the smell of burnt toast and children's voices. For a moment, she thought she was dreaming, clear as throat. Some fever-induced hallucination where her penthouse apartment had transformed into a place with peeling wallpaper and a ceiling stain shaped like Ohio. Then, she opened her eyes and saw the truth. She was in a bedroom barely larger than her walk-in closet, lying on a mattress on the floor, covered with a blanket that smelled like laundry detergent and something else she could not identify. Poverty. Maybe the kind that clung to fabric no matter how many times you washed it. She sat up too quickly and immediately regretted it. Her head spun, her body HHD in places she had forgotten could ache, and her mouth tasted like something had died in it. She was still wearing her blouse and skirt from yesterday, wrinkled beyond recognition, one stocking torn at the knee. Her shoes were gone, her phone was gone, her entire sense of reality was gone. The door opened and a small girl appeared, maybe 8 years old, holding a glass of water in both hands like it was precious. She had dark curls pulled into a lopsided ponytail and wore pajamas with cartoon characters Victoria did not recognize. The girl stopped in the doorway, staring at Victoria with the kind of unfiltered curiosity only children possessed. "You're awake," the girl said, then turned and shouted over her shoulder, "Dad, she's awake." Victoria heard footsteps, and then the man from last night appeared behind the girl, Ethan. She remembered his name now, remembered the way he had knelt beside her on the marble floor, the concern in his voice when he asked if she could hear him. He looked different in daylight, younger than she had thought, maybe early 30s, with the kind of tired eyes that came from working nights and raising a child alone. He put a hand on the girl's shoulder, a gesture so gentle it made something in Victoria's chest tighten. "Lily, go finish your breakfast," Ethan said quietly. The girl handed Victoria the water glass and disappeared, leaving them alone in the small room. Victoria drank the entire glass without stopping. The water was cold and tasted faintly metallic. Nothing like the filtered water she was used to, but it was the best thing she had ever consumed. When she finished, she set the glass down on the floor and looked at Ethan properly. He stood in the doorway like he was afraid to come closer, like she might shatter if he moved too fast. "Where am I?" Victoria's voice came out, barely above a whisper. "My apartment," Ethan said. "You collapsed at the tower last night. You were burning up with fever, and you asked me not to call anyone, so I brought you here. I gave you some ibuprofen around 3:0 the morning when your temperature spiked. It's been coming down since then." The words should have terrified her. She should have demanded her phone, called her driver, gotten out of this place immediately. But instead, she found herself asking the question that had been circling her mind since she woke. "Why didn't you call my father?" Ethan leaned against the doorframe, crossing his arms over his chest. He wore a faded t-shirt and jeans, his feet bare on the cold floor. Nothing about him suggested threat or ulterior motive. He just looked exhausted. "You begged me not to," he said simply. Seemed important. Victoria closed her eyes. The memory came back in fragments. The late night at the office, the meeting that had gone too long. The moment she realized she could not remember the last time she had eaten. She had felt the fever coming on for hours, but ignored it, the way she ignored most things her body tried to tell her. Weakness was not allowed in her world. Vulnerability was a death sentence, and calling her father for help was the fastest way to prove she could not handle the job he had given her. "How long have I been here?" she asked. "About 8 hours. It's morning now." Saturday. She had meetings on Saturday. A conference call with the London office. A review of the quarterly reports. A dinner with potential investors. Every minute she spent in this tiny apartment was a minute her father would notice her absence. A minute her carefully constructed facade of control crumbled. "I need to leave," Victoria said, swinging her legs off the mattress. Her body disagreed violently with this decision. The room tilted sideways, and she had to grab the edge of the mattress to keep from falling. Ethan moved in, crossing the room in 2 steps, and crouching beside her. He did not touch her, but his presence was steadying. "You can barely stand," he said. "The blizzard dumped another 6 inches overnight. Even if you could walk, you're not going anywhere until the plows clear the streets." Victoria wanted to argue, to insist that she had walked through worse, that she did not need help from a janitor in an apartment that probably cost less per month than her daily coffee habit. But the truth was undeniable. She was trapped here, dependent on the kindness of a stranger who had every reason to call the tabloids and sell this story for more money than he would make in a year. "Why are you helping me?" The question came out sharper than she intended, edged with suspicion she could not quite suppress. Ethan stood up, putting distance between them again. When he spoke, his voice carried no resentment, no hidden agenda, just a simple statement of fact. "Because you needed help, and I was there," he said. That's it. The answer was so honest, it made Victoria's throat tighten. In her world, no one did anything without calculating the return on investment, without weighing the political advantage, without considering how it would look to the board or the shareholders or the press. Altruism was a strategy, not a virtue. But Ethan looked at her like she was just another person, not a CEO or a Hale or someone whose downfall would make headlines. He looked at her like she was human. From the kitchen, Lily called out that breakfast was getting cold. Ethan glanced toward the door, then back at Victoria. "You should eat something," he said. "I'll find you some clean clothes. We can figure out the rest after." He left before she could respond, closing the door behind him with a soft click. Victoria sat alone in the small room, listening to the muffled sounds of a child laughing and dishes clattering, and realized she could not remember the last time someone had taken care of her without being paid to do it. The feeling was unfamiliar and uncomfortable, and something else she could not quite name. It felt dangerous. It felt like hope. The call came 3 days later, just as Victoria was starting to believe she might actually escape this situation without consequences. Her fever had broken on Sunday. By Monday, she was strong enough to leave, but Ethan's ancient sedan refused to start in the cold, and the buses were running on limited schedules due to the storm damage. She told herself she was waiting for practical reasons, for transportation, for the right moment, for the strength to walk 6 blocks to a taxi stand. But the truth was more complicated. She had spent 3 days in a world she had never imagined existed, watching Ethan navigate the impossible mathematics of poverty with a grace that shamed her. He worked nights, slept 4 hours, made breakfast for Lily, walked her to school in boots, held together with duct tape, then came home to check on Victoria before collapsing into sleep on the living room couch. He never complained. He never asked her for money or favors, or anything beyond basic courtesy. He lived in a space so small that Victoria's master bathroom could have fit inside it twice, and yet somehow, he had made room for her without resentment. Lily had adopted Victoria with the enthusiasm of a child who rarely got to talk to adults besides her father and teachers. She asked endless questions. What Victoria's favorite color was, whether she had ever seen a real penguin, why she wore suits instead of comfortable clothes. Victoria found herself answering honestly, something she rarely did even with people she had known for years. There was no performance required with Lily, no calculation of how each word would be perceived or weaponized later. The girl simply wanted to know her, and that simple desire was more disarming than any boardroom power play. The apartment phone rang on Monday evening, while Ethan was helping Lily with homework at the kitchen table. Victoria was folding the blanket she had been using on the couch, a small gesture of helpfulness in a situation where she felt utterly useless, when she heard Ethan's voice change. The warmth drained out of it, replaced by something careful and flat. "Yes, sir," Ethan said into the phone. "I understand. Tomorrow at 2. "Yes, sir." He hung up and stood completely still for a moment, staring at the phone like it had just delivered a death sentence. Lily looked up from her math worksheet, sensing the shift in atmosphere the way children always did. "Who was that, Dad?" she asked. "Nobody, sweetheart," Ethan said. But his voice came out wrong. "Keep working on problem 6. Victoria knew. She did not know how she knew, but the certainty settled in her stomach like ice. Her father had found out. Richard Hale, who had built an empire on information and control, who knew everything that happened in his company and most things that happened in his city, had somehow discovered that his daughter had been missing for 3 days, and traced her to this apartment. Ethan walked past her without making eye contact, went into his bedroom, and closed the door. Victoria waited exactly 30 seconds before following him. She found him sitting on the edge of the mattress, his head in his hands, shoulders rigid with tension. "It was him, wasn't it?" Victoria said. Not a question. Ethan looked up. In his eyes, she saw fear. Not the kind that came from physical danger, but the quieter, more devastating kind that came from knowing you were about to lose everything you had worked for and there was nothing you could do to stop it. "He wants to see me tomorrow," Ethan said at his office. "He didn't say why, but I know why." Victoria sat down beside him, leaving a careful distance between them. Through the thin walls, she could hear Lily humming to herself in the kitchen, oblivious to the earthquake about to hit their lives. "I should never have stayed," Victoria said quietly. "I should have left the first day, called a car, dealt with the consequences. This is my fault." "You were sick," Ethan said. "You needed help. That's not a fault. In my world, it is." The words hung in the air between them, carrying more truth than Victoria had intended to reveal. In her world, the world of quarterly earnings and hostile takeovers, and fathers who measured love in stock options, needing help was the ultimate weakness. Showing vulnerability meant showing your throat to predators who had been waiting years for the opportunity to strike. Her father had taught her that lesson before she could read, and she had never forgotten it. But here, in this apartment, where the heat barely worked, and dinner was whatever could be stretched to feed 3 people, she had been vulnerable for 3 days, and nothing terrible had happened. Ethan had not exploited her weakness, or sold her story, or demanded anything in return for his kindness. He had simply helped her, the way one human being helped another, and the simplicity of that act had shaken the foundation of everything she believed about how the world worked. "What will you tell him?" Victoria asked. Ethan stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the alley where trash bins overflowed and snow turned gray with soot. His next words came out quiet, but she heard the steel underneath them. "The truth," he said, "that I found you sick. That you asked me not to call anyone. That I made a choice to help you instead of following protocol. Whatever happens after that is on me." "He'll ruin you," Victoria said flatly. "My father doesn't forgive people who step outside the lines, even when they're trying to help, especially when they're trying to help. He'll see it as overreach." Assuming you had the right to make decisions about his daughter, He'll fire you. He might do worse. I know. The resignation in his voice made Victoria stand up. She crossed the room and grabbed his arm, forcing him to look at her. Then don't go, she said. I'll call him. I'll explain what happened. I'll take responsibility. Ethan shook his head slowly. That would make it worse. He'd think I put you up to it, or that I'm using you somehow. Men like your father don't believe people like me do things without angles. The accuracy of that statement stung because Victoria knew it was true. Her father had spent his entire life surrounded by people who wanted something from him. Clear as throat, money, access, power, revenge. He had learned to see every interaction as a transaction, every kindness as a manipulation. The idea that a janitor had helped his daughter out of simple human decency would not compute in Richard Hale's worldview. He would search for the scheme, the leverage, the hidden motive, and when he could not find one, he would invent one. So what do we do? Victoria asked, and realized with a start that she had said, we, as if their fates were bound together now, as if the distance between their worlds had somehow collapsed in the space of 3 days. Ethan pulled his arm gently from her grip and managed a smile that did not reach his eyes. We don't do anything, he said. I go to the meeting tomorrow. I tell your father the truth, and then I come home and figure out how to explain to Lily why we're moving to a worse apartment in a worse neighborhood because her dad made the wrong choice at the wrong time. It wasn't the wrong choice. Tell that to my landlord when the rent check bounces. The bitter humor in his voice broke something in Victoria. She had spent her entire adult life making calculated decisions, weighing risks and benefits, choosing the option that maximized profit and minimized exposure. She had never made a choice simply because it was right, simply because someone needed help and she was capable of providing it. Ethan had made that choice without hesitation, and now he was going to pay a price that would alter the trajectory of his entire life. The meeting was scheduled for 2:00 the afternoon, which meant Ethan had to call in sick to his shift and arrange backup care for Lily. Each of these actions cost money he did not have. The shift meant 8 hours of lost wages. The babysitter meant $20 he could not spare. Victoria offered to pay, and the look Ethan gave her made it clear that offering again would be an insult. She wanted to go with him, to stand beside him in her father's office and tell Richard Hale that his daughter had made her own choices, that Ethan had simply honored her wishes, that punishing kindness was the fastest way to create a world where no one helped anyone. But Ethan refused. He went alone, wearing his only dress shirt and a tie borrowed from a neighbor, looking like a man on his way to his own execution. Victoria waited in the apartment with Lily, who was home from school with a cold. They played cards at the kitchen table while the hours crawled past. Lily won every game through a combination of luck and enthusiasm, chattering about her classmates and her favorite teacher and the science fair project she wanted to do about crystals. Victoria tried to focus, tried to respond appropriately, but her mind kept drifting to the office 43 floors above the city, where her father was undoubtedly dissecting Ethan's life with the precision of a surgeon removing a tumor. Ethan came back at 4:30. Victoria knew the meeting had gone badly before he said a word. It was in the way he moved carefully, like his body had forgotten how to coordinate its parts. He nodded at the babysitter, paid her with bills, he counted out slowly, and waited until she left before sitting down at the table across from Victoria. Lily had fallen asleep on the couch, worn out from coughing. He fired you, Victoria said. Not exactly. Ethan's voice came out hollow. He was very polite about it, said he appreciated my dedication to employee safety, that I had shown initiative and quick thinking in a difficult situation. Then he offered me a severance package, 3 months' pay, on the condition that I sign a non-disclosure agreement and resign effective immediately. That's firing you with paperwork. Yes, Victoria waited for the rest. There was always a rest with her father, a secondary move designed to ensure compliance and discourage resistance. He also mentioned that my apartment building was scheduled for a safety inspection next week. Ethan continued, still staring at the table, said there had been complaints about code violations, that the landlord might face fines if the building wasn't brought up to standard. He suggested I might want to start looking for a new place to live just in case the inspection didn't go well and the building had to be evacuated for repairs. The threat was elegant in its deniability. Richard Hale had not directly threatened Ethan's housing. He had simply mentioned information, made a suggestion, allowed the implications to speak for themselves. If Ethan complained, if he went to the press or tried to make noise about wrongful termination, the inspection would happen and the building would fail, and Lily would end up in a shelter. The message was clear. Take the money, sign the paper, disappear quietly. There's more, Victoria said, because she knew her father, knew how he operated. Ethan finally looked at her. He knows about Lily's school. He didn't say it directly, but he mentioned how important it is for children to have stable educational environments, how disruptive it can be when families have to move mid-year. He knows which school she attends. He knows her teacher's name. He wanted me to know that he knows. The casual cruelty of it made Victoria's hands curl into fists under the table. Her father had identified the one thing Ethan cared about more than his own safety and turned it into a weapon. It was a classic Richard Hale move. Find the pressure point, apply force, watch the target collapse. She had seen him do it to competitors, to business partners, to board members who questioned his decisions. She had never thought he would do it to someone whose only crime was showing his daughter basic human kindness. I'll talk to him, Victoria said. I'll tell him to back off. That will make it worse. He'll see it as confirmation that I have some kind of influence over you, that I'm a problem that needs to be dealt with more permanently. So, what then? You just accept this, sign his papers, and let him win? Ethan laughed, a sound with no humor in it. He's already won, Victoria. Men like your father always win. The game was rigged before I sat down at the table. The defeat in his voice hurt worse than anything her father had done. Victoria had spent 3 days watching Ethan move through the world with dignity intact, despite the weight of poverty and single parenthood and 1,000 small injustices that would have broken most people. He worked jobs that ground people down to nothing, lived in an apartment that leaked heat and dignity in equal measure, and somehow maintained a core of decency that seemed immune to the rot that infected everyone in her orbit. But her father had found a way to break him anyway by threatening the one person he could not protect through sheer determination. The photograph appeared 3 days later. Victoria had moved back to her penthouse by then, had returned to the office and the meetings and the endless performance of control. She had tried to maintain distance from Ethan to protect him through absence, but the damage was already spreading in ways neither of them had anticipated. Someone had seen Ethan carrying her out of Hale Tower during the blizzard. The photo mix was grainy, shot from a distance by a security camera in the parking garage, but it was clear enough. Victoria unconscious in the arms of a man in a janitor's uniform being loaded into a beat-up sedan in the middle of the night. The image suggested a dozen stories, none of them true, all of them incendiary. The tabloids ran with it immediately. Hale's in mystery midnight exit. Janitor's secret rescue or something more. The stories wrote themselves. Forbidden romance, scandal in the tower, the billionaire, and the working man. They dug into Ethan's background with the efficiency of predators scenting blood. Single father, night shift worker, apartment in a low-income neighborhood. Every detail was weaponized, turned into evidence of either gold-digging opportunism or proof that Victoria Hale was having some kind of breakdown. The board called an emergency meeting. Victoria sat through 2 hours of thinly veiled concern that was really outright panic about the company's reputation. They wanted explanations, assurances, a strategy to contain the damage. They wanted her to issue a statement denying any inappropriate relationship, to distance herself from Ethan completely, to remind the world that she was untouchable and he was nobody. Her father sat at the head of the table saying nothing, but his silence spoke volumes. This was a test. How she handled this crisis would determine whether she kept her position or whether he decided she was too damaged, too compromised to lead the company he had built. The pressure came from every direction. Her assistant fielded dozens of media requests per hour. Her phone rang constantly with calls from investors, partners, friends who were not really friends, asking if she was okay with a tone that suggested they hoped she was not. The narrative had already been written, and it did not matter that the truth was simpler and sadder than any of the stories circulating. In the court of public opinion, perception was reality, and the perception was that Victoria Hale had made a catastrophic error in judgment. Ethan faced his own siege. Reporters camped outside his apartment building, shouting questions every time he took Lily to school. His phone number leaked online, resulting in hundreds of calls from strangers offering everything from book deals to death threats. Someone spray-painted "Gold Digger" on his car. Lily came home from school crying because kids were repeating things their parents had said, ugly things about her father and the rich lady he was supposedly using for money. He called Victoria once late at night from a payphone because he did not trust his cell. His voice sounded like it was coming from underwater, distant and distorted. "I signed the non-disclosure agreement," he said without preamble. "Took your father's money. I can't talk to the press. Can't defend myself. Can't even tell the truth without getting sued into oblivion. And it doesn't matter anyway, because no one would believe me. Ethan, they're going to force me out of the apartment." He continued, talking over her. The inspection happened. Surprise! The building failed. "We have 30 days to find somewhere else to live. Lily is terrified. She thinks we're going to be homeless." Victoria gripped the phone hard enough to hurt. "Let me help. I can find you a place I can." "No." The word came out sharp, final. "You helping makes it worse. Every time you try to fix this, it confirms what everyone already thinks. That I'm your charity case, your mistake, your dirty secret. I need you to stay away from us." The line went dead. Victoria stood in her penthouse, surrounded by luxury that suddenly felt like a prison, and understood that her father had won more completely than she had imagined possible. He had not just separated her from Ethan. He had made it impossible for her to help without causing more harm, had turned her every impulse toward decency into another weapon to be used against the man who had saved her life. The tabloids kept running stories. The board kept circulating memos about crisis management. Her father kept watching her with those calculating eyes, waiting to see if she would crumble or rise to meet his expectations. And Ethan kept living his life in the wreckage of a kindness that had cost him everything. Unable to speak the truth, unable to defend himself, unable to do anything but survive. Victoria had spent her entire life believing that power and money could solve any problem. Now, for the first time, she understood what it meant to be truly helpless. Not because she lacked resources, but because the very tools she had always relied on had become the instruments of destruction. Every move she made would be watched, analyzed, weaponized. Every attempt to help would be twisted into evidence of guilt. The only way to protect Ethan was to abandon him completely. And that abandonment felt like a betrayal. Worse than anything her father had done. The board meeting was scheduled for Friday morning, 10 days after the photograph appeared. Victoria knew what it meant. A formal review of her leadership, a performance evaluation disguised as procedural routine, an opportunity for the board to express their concerns about whether she could continue to represent the company, effectively given the media scrutiny. Her father had called it himself, which meant he had already made his decision. This was not a meeting. It was an execution. She spent the night before in her office reviewing financials and strategic reports, building a case for her continued leadership based on metrics and results. Under her guidance, the company had expanded into 3 new markets, increased revenue by 18%, and secured partnerships that would position them for dominance in the next decade. The numbers were undeniable. Her competence was undeniable, but numbers had never mattered as much as image in her father's world, and her image was currently plastered across tabloids with headlines that made her stomach turn. At 6:00 the morning, her assistant knocked on the office door. The woman looked uncomfortable, which was unusual. She had worked for Victoria for 5 years and had learned to maintain professional distance from even the most chaotic situations. "There's someone here to see you," the assistant said carefully. "He doesn't have an appointment, but he says it's urgent." Security tried to turn him away, but he's been waiting in the lobby for 3 hours. Victoria knew before asking. "Ethan?" "Yes, ma'am." Every instinct told her to send him away to protect both of them from the additional scrutiny that would come from being seen together again. But the fact that he had come at all, had walked through a lobby full of security cameras, and into a building where he had been explicitly told never to return meant something had changed. Something had broken. "Send him up," Victoria said. He appeared 5 minutes later, escorted by 2 security guards who looked ready to tackle him if he made any sudden movements. He wore the same clothes he had worn to meet her father, the borrowed tie, the only dress shirt, and he looked like he had not slept in days. The guards deposited him in her office and stationed themselves outside the door, visible through the glass wall. Ethan stood in the center of the room, looking around at the space that was larger than his entire apartment, at the view that stretched across the city to the lake beyond. When he finally looked at Victoria, his eyes carried a weight that made her stand up from behind her desk. "They're going to take Lily away from me," he said without preamble. "Child Services showed up yesterday. Anonymous complaint about living conditions, about my ability to provide stable housing. They saw the apartment, saw the eviction notice, asked questions about my employment status. They're opening an investigation." The words hit Victoria like physical blows. Her father had found a new pressure point, a way to ensure Ethan's complete silence and cooperation. Threatening a man's livelihood was one thing. Threatening his child was something else entirely. "He did this," Victoria said, "not a question. I can't prove it. The complaint is anonymous, but the timing is convenient, isn't it? Right before your board meeting. Right when I might be tempted to go to the press and tell the actual story." Ethan's voice shook with barely controlled rage. "He wants to make sure I stay quiet, and he knows the one thing that will guarantee my cooperation is Lily's safety." "I'll fix this," Victoria said, already reaching for her phone. "I'll call the best family lawyer in the city." "I'll know." Ethan cut her off, the words sharp enough to make her freeze. "I'm done letting you fix things. Every time you try to help, it makes everything worse. Your money, your lawyers, your father's connections, they're all part of the same system that's crushing me. I don't need you to save me, Victoria. I need you to make a choice." The room went very quiet. Through the glass wall, Victoria could see the security guards watching them, see her assistant pretending not to stare from her desk. The entire building was probably watching, waiting to see what the scandal-plagued CEO would do when confronted by the man at the center of her downfall. "What choice?" Victoria asked, though she already knew. Ethan took a step closer, close enough that she could see the exhaustion etched into his face, the resignation in his eyes. "You have a board meeting in 4 hours," he said. "They're going to ask you to choose between your position and your association with me. Your father has probably already told them that the only way to restore the company's reputation is for you to publicly distance yourself from this situation, to denounce me as someone who took advantage of you during a moment of weakness. He wants you to throw me to the wolves to save yourself. I won't do that. You should." The words came out flat, factual. "You should get up in front of that board and tell them exactly what they want to hear. That I overstepped, that you were sick and vulnerable, and I made decisions I had no right to make. You should save your career and let me deal with the consequences." Victoria stared at him, trying to understand what he was actually asking for. His words said one thing, but his presence here, the fact that he had risked everything to come see her before the meeting, suggested something else. "Is that what you want me to do?" she asked quietly. "No." The admission seemed to cost him something. "I want you to stand up in front of those people and tell them the truth. That you were sick, that you asked me not to call anyone, that I made a choice to help you because it was the right thing to do. I want you to defend that choice, even if it costs you everything. Because, if you don't, if you let your father turn kindness into a crime, then Lily grows up in a world where helping people is punished and looking the other way is rewarded. And I can't accept that world for her." The request was impossible. It was professional suicide. It was everything her father had trained her not to do, showing weakness, admitting vulnerability, caring more about principle than power. But it was also the first honest thing anyone had asked of her in years. Victoria walked into the board meeting at exactly 9. The room went silent when she entered, 12 pairs of eyes tracking her movement to the empty chair across from her father. Richard Hale sat at the head of the table, his expression neutral, giving nothing away. But Victoria knew him well enough to see the anticipation beneath the mask. He thought he knew how this would play out. He thought he had already won. The preliminary reports took 20 minutes. Financial updates, market analysis, the kind of routine business that filled board meetings and meant nothing in the context of what everyone was really here to discuss. Victoria delivered her updates with the precision she had learned at her father's knee, presenting data that proved her competence even as the elephant in the room grew larger with each passing minute. Finally, the CFO cleared his throat and addressed what everyone was thinking. "We need to discuss the recent media attention," he said carefully. "The board is concerned about the impact on the company's reputation. We've seen a 3% drop in stock price since the story broke, and our public relations team is fielding dozens of inquiries daily." "I'm aware," Victoria said. "We need a strategy to contain this." Another board member added a clear statement that distances the company from the situation, that reassures investors this was an isolated incident of poor judgment that won't be repeated. Victoria looked at her father. He was watching her with those calculating eyes, waiting to see if she would take the exit he had carefully constructed. All she had to do was read from the script, express regret, accept responsibility, promise to maintain appropriate professional boundaries in the future. The board would accept it, the media would move on, and her position would be secure. It was the smart play. It was the only play. "I'd like to clarify something," Victoria said, her voice steady. "The situation with Ethan Brooks was not an incident of poor judgment. It was an act of extraordinary kindness during a moment when I desperately needed help." The room shifted. Someone coughed. Her father's expression did not change, but his hand tightened slightly on the pen he was holding. Victoria continued, ignoring the tension radiating from every corner of the table. 10 days ago, I collapsed from fever while working late. I was alone on the 43rd floor, disoriented and ill enough that I should have been in a hospital. Ethan Brooks, who was working his shift as a janitor, found me. I specifically asked him not to call for official help because I was afraid of exactly this: the judgment, the media scrutiny, the assumption that needing help meant weakness. "Victoria," her father said quietly. A warning. She talked over him. Something she had never done in a board meeting. Something she had never dared to do in her entire life. "Ethan made a choice to honor my wishes. He took me to his home, cared for me through the worst of the fever, and asked for nothing in return. When I recovered, when I was strong enough to leave, the media had already created a narrative that had nothing to do with the truth, and we responded to that narrative by punishing the person who helped me." "This is not the appropriate forum," the CFO started. "This is exactly the appropriate forum," Victoria cut him off. "Because the board is asking me to choose between protecting my position and protecting my integrity. You want me to throw Ethan Brooks under the bus to save the company's reputation. But what you're really asking me to do is confirm that Hale Industries values image over humanity, that we punish kindness and reward callousness, that the people who work for us are disposable the moment they become inconvenient." The silence that followed was absolute. No one moved. No one seemed to breathe. Victoria's heart hammered against her ribs, but she kept her voice level, kept her gaze steady on her father's face. "Ethan Brooks lost his job because he helped me," she continued. "He lost his housing. He's being investigated by Child Protective Services based on an anonymous complaint that appeared at a very convenient time. All of this happened because he made a compassionate choice when he could have easily walked away and let me suffer the consequences of my own pride." "That's enough," Richard Hale said, his voice carrying the weight of authority that had silenced rooms for 40 years. Victoria stood up. "No, it's not, because if we let this stand, if we allow a good man to be destroyed for doing the right thing, then we're admitting that everything this company claims to value is a lie. We talk about integrity and community investment and supporting working families, but we're willing to ruin a single father's life to protect a stock price." She turned to address the full board, making eye contact with each member in turn. "I understand that my association with this situation has created challenges for the company. I understand that some of you may feel I've damaged our reputation, but I will not apologize for being helped when I needed it, and I will not condemn the person who showed me basic human decency. If that costs me my position, then I accept that consequence." Richard Hale stood slowly, his chair scraping against the floor. For a moment, Victoria thought he was going to order her out of the room, strip her of her title in front of the entire board, make an example of her that would echo through the company for years. Instead, he did something she had never seen him do in a professional setting. He smiled. Not the calculated smile he used with investors or the thin smile he gave to competitors before crushing them. A real smile, small and complicated, and almost proud. "I owe this board an apology," Richard said, his voice carrying the same authority, but with a different quality underneath it. "I have spent the past 2 weeks testing my daughter's leadership in the worst possible way. I created pressure, manufactured consequences, and waited to see if she would sacrifice principle for power the way I taught her to do." The board members looked at each other, confused. Victoria felt the ground shifting under her feet, uncertain whether this was another manipulation or something genuine. "When I built this company," Richard continued, "I believed that success required ruthlessness, that showing weakness was fatal, that the only thing that mattered was winning. I taught Victoria those same lessons. I raised her to be hard, to be calculating, to never let sentiment interfere with strategy." He looked directly at Victoria, and in his eyes, she saw something she had never seen before. Regret. "I was wrong." He turned back to the board. "The world is changing. The next generation doesn't want leaders who sacrifice people for profit. They want leaders who can be both strong and compassionate, who can make hard decisions without losing their humanity." I spent 2 weeks trying to force my daughter to choose between those qualities, and she refused. She chose both. She chose right. Richard walked around the table to stand beside Victoria. "Effective immediately, I'm announcing my retirement as chairman. Victoria Hale will assume full leadership of Hale Industries, and her first official act will be to implement a comprehensive review of our employment practices, starting with how we treat our lowest-paid workers." He extended his hand to Victoria. She stared at it, trying to process what had just happened. Whether this was real or another test disguised as victory. "This was all a test?" she asked quietly. "Yes," Richard said. "And no, I did want to see what you were made of. But I also needed to see what I was made of. Whether I could let go of control. Whether I could admit that my way wasn't the only way. Whether I could trust you to build something better than what I created." Victoria took his hand, the gesture formal but carrying weight beyond the board meeting and the investigation into Ethan. "The housing issues, child protective services will be resolved by the end of the day," Richard said, along with a formal apology. "A job offer in our facilities management division with a salary commensurate with his new responsibilities and assistance, finding appropriate housing for his family. He won't want charity." "Good. Because that's not what I'm offering. I'm offering him a position he's qualified for with benefits he's earned in a company that should have recognized his value from the beginning." Richard released her hand and addressed the board. "We've spent years talking about corporate responsibility and community investment. It's time we actually meant it." Spring came late that year. The snow finally melted in April, revealing grass that had survived the winter and trash that had not. Ethan stood in the small yard behind his new apartment. Not large, but larger than before. In a building with working heat and a landlord who answered calls, watching Lily dig holes for the flower bulbs Victoria had brought. Victoria knelt in the dirt beside his daughter, her designer jeans already stained beyond saving, showing Lily how to space the tulip bulbs evenly. She had been coming around once a week since March, sometimes with flowers or books, sometimes with nothing but time. She never stayed long. The boundary between their worlds was still there, maybe always would be, but it had become permeable in a way neither of them had expected. "Dad, can we plant the purple ones here?" Lily called out, holding up a bulb like a treasure. "Wherever you want, sweetheart," Ethan said. Victoria glanced up at him, dirt smudged on her cheek, looking more alive than he had ever seen her in the boardroom or her penthouse. She had cut her hair shorter, had started leaving the office before 8 most nights, had begun learning the names of the people who cleaned her building and asking about their families. Small changes, but they mattered. "Your father called yesterday," Victoria said, patting soil around a bulb. He wants to do a profile on our new worker support initiatives for the company newsletter. I told him only if he interviews you directly. I'm not doing a press interview. It's not press, it's internal communications, and you're the director of facilities now. You don't get to hide in the background anymore." Ethan shook his head, but he was smiling. The job had been strange at first, going from cleaning floors to managing the people who cleaned them, from invisibility to leadership. But it turned out he was good at it, good at seeing the inefficiencies that everyone else had stopped noticing, good at advocating for the workers who had no voice in rooms where decisions were made. Victoria had promoted him twice in 3 months, and he had earned every step. Lily finished planting and ran inside to wash her hands, leaving Victoria and Ethan alone in the yard. The afternoon sun slanted through the trees, warming the air enough that jackets were unnecessary. In a few weeks, the bulbs would sprout. In a few months, there would be flowers. The board approved the wage increase, Victoria said, standing and brushing dirt from her knees. 15% across all hourly positions effective next quarter. And we're funding a child care program for employees with kids under 10. That'll cost millions. We can afford it. Turns out investing in people is good for business. Turnover is down, productivity is up, and we're getting recruitment applications from workers who actually want to be here. She looked at him, something complicated moving behind her eyes. You changed everything. You know, one choice, one night, and you changed the whole trajectory. Ethan thought about that night often. The blizzard, the fever, the moment he decided to help instead of following protocol. It had cost him almost everything before giving him more than he had imagined possible. Not wealth, not power, but something better. A sense that his work mattered. That his daughter would grow up seeing him treated with dignity. That kindness was not always punished in a world that seemed designed to crush it. "I just did what felt right," he said. "I know. That's what made it revolutionary." Lily burst back through the door, hands dripping wet, shouting that she wanted to plant vegetables next. Victoria laughed and promised to bring tomato seeds next week. Ethan watched them planting the garden together, his daughter and the billionaire CEO, their heads bent over a seed catalog, arguing about whether beans or cucumbers grew faster, and felt something settle in his chest. This was not a fairy tale. There was no dramatic kiss, no merger of worlds, no dissolution of the class divide that separated them. Victoria still lived in her penthouse. Ethan still lived in an apartment where the walls were thin and the neighbors were loud, but they had found something that mattered more than romance or wealth or any of the narratives the tabloids had tried to write. They had found a way to be human together, to build something real in the space between their different worlds. And in that space, tulip bulbs waited in dark soil for the moment they would reach toward light.